The third episode of The Last of Us Season 2 has just been released, and following an incredibly emotional episode last week, it was always going to be a difficult one to follow. However, with an incredibly powerful opening scene, the show managed to capture all of the emotion that was necessary for that quality to leak over during the beginning of this installment. With Ellie and Dina both looking to get justice for the torturous death of Joel by going after Abby, but with them not getting the answer and support that they were looking for in the council, we saw them take matters into their own hands. This episode was a slow one, let's not deny it, but I feel like with what's on the horizon due to the preview, this was almost the calm before the storm. So with that, let's dive into the episode and break down all that there was to take away from it. Here is The Last of Us Season 2 Episode 3 Ending Explained. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. The opening scene. The opening scene of this episode was one that I felt was the perfect way to pick right back up from the ending of the previous one. It allowed the emotions and the weight of what we saw with Joel's death to be present, whilst reminding us of the purpose as to why Ellie was setting out on getting justice. The horrific opening shot of the deceased infected that were being burned so all traces could be eradicated, but it being the only thing that was providing light, was something that was really haunting. It was easy to remember the death of Joel from the previous episode, but the destruction that hit the entire community of Jackson, whilst not as front of mind and powerful as Joel being killed to us, we had to be reminded of the consequences that it brought and the mindset shift that many of the residents had because of it, which ultimately went on to play an important role in the story of the residents voting against the posse. The next part of the opening scene in having the more personal, intimate, somber moment with Tommy looking over the body of his dead brother Joel, washing him and saying, "Give Sarah my love." It was something that was absolutely heartbreaking to bear witness to. With there also being a focus on Joel's watch being shattered, the watch which Sarah gave him, and it most likely being broken because it was the moment that Sarah was killed, it held significant meaning because of that. Even though the watch didn't tell the time, it was a part of her that he carried with him all of those years later, even though the watch in itself was redundant. With them now being together and seeing the watch face being shattered, there was this sense of finality. The two characters that we started the entire show with were no longer in it. I expected this room to just have Joel and Tommy in it. I didn't expect the sheer amount of bodies that were under the blankets that were covered. It was haunting seeing all of those dead, and it really showed how hard hit Jackson was by the infected, and again, how Abby's actions ultimately caused a ripple effect and for the entire town to be hit. As well, it also connected to the importance of, is Joel's life more important than the others, as everybody lost people that day, albeit not in a murderous way through another person, but it allowed us to understand more why the council ultimately voted against sending a posse after Abby and Wolf. The final part of the opening scene that I thought was just perfect was when we first laid eyes on Ellie. We saw her coming to after being unconscious, and as she awoke, a tear rolled down her face and she was in shock as she was reliving Joel's death over and over again. The scream that she let out spoke 1,000 words, and you could really see that she was still stuck in that moment where she was watching the person that she cared about most being killed. With her scream being the final thing that we heard in the opening scene, not only was it powerful and emotional, but it showed us the reason for the episode. This was trauma that she wasn't going to forget anytime soon, and even though she masked her reason for going after Abby as justice, it was most definitely going to be revenge-driven. What the ending means. When it came to the ending of this episode, we saw that Ellie and Dina, after being denied the opportunity by the council to rally up a posse to go after Abby and the rest of Wolf to kill them for Joel, herself and Dina took it upon themselves and went off on their own. This was with the assistance of Seth, who brought them supplies and helped sneak them out. He was surprisingly on the same side as them and wanted to get revenge too. He was like this because he knew that if nobody was going to stick up for themselves in the community, then others would get a sniff of that weakness on the outside and then come back and get more. This was all set around 3 months after Joel's death, and by then, Abby, Owen, Manny and Nora had made it back to Seattle where Wolf were based. Ellie and Dina were going to Seattle whilst under the impression that Wolf were a relatively small organization and were just a small regional group that were planning on fighting against Fedra. However, it seemed like Ellie and Dina didn't realize quite what they were walking into. An army that made up the Washington Liberation Front. It seems like they thought that they'd be fighting a handful of people based on Dina's loose intel in saying that she doubted that there were many of them. However, with us seeing military equipment that's far beyond what they're used to in Jackson, they're definitely going to be walking into the unknown and have the potential to be captured. Who were the cult and who killed them? During this episode, we were introduced to a cult that was walking through the trail that was on the border towards Seattle. These characters wore these green robes, had a Glasgow smile, and spoke of a prophet that they worshipped that hadn't been around for about 10 years. This was the first religious type group that we've come across in this post-apocalyptic environment, so it was an interesting dynamic to see for sure. Viewing an individual that helped fight against infected as a savior from God rather than a mere mortal. This cult that we saw for the first time were called the Seraphites, and they were a group that were constantly on watch. When compared to the likes of Wolf and even Jackson, they didn't have advanced weapons at all. They had hammers and bow and arrows, and it was almost like medieval warfare, so the chance of them putting up a good fight if they came across anybody that was slightly more advanced was very slim. Hence why their approach and mantra for staying safe was distance rather than weapons. A moment that I thought was quite impactful was when we saw Constance being given the hammer and her smiling and saying that she now felt safer that she had it. But then, as we saw later on in the episode, it was redundant, as the entirety of the cult, even the children, had been butchered and killed, regardless of who they were. With it seeming like Isaac, the leader of Wolf, is going to be introduced to us and him having a history in fighting against the Seraphites, I think it was most likely Wolf that were responsible for the death of the cult. With the response that they had to potentially being spotted, it seemed like they were extremely fearful of what Wolf could potentially do to them, and as we saw, they were right to have that level of fear. Abby's killing of Joel was something that first showed us how ruthless they could be, but the mass slaughtering of people that just simply wanted to get away, it was our second true insight into the mindset that they had and the brutal, harsh approach that's embedded within them. Ellie's mindset. Ellie's mindset in this episode was one that I found really interesting as it was being explored. During the beginning of the episode, she seemed fine, but then as it went on, we saw that she'd put up a mask and was hiding her pain in front of Gal so that she could be discharged from the hospital. There was a line that she said which was, "Your final moment with somebody doesn't define your time with them." However, with the last interaction that she had with Joel being one that was an argument, I think that is something that sits within her mind. Her drastic change in facial expression as she left the room was also reflective of that. When she returned home, the fact that she went into the house instead of the garage, the very place that she'd been avoiding for such a long time, it was almost like she was walking through a room full of ghosts. The mattressless bed and the emptiness of her room almost reflected how she wasn't there for him at the end. And then in seeing shirts that he usually wore all hanging up, a subtle detail of somebody that was a key feature of their wardrobe, it made her break down even more as she looked to smell his scent and grasp onto any part of him that remained. I think Ellie has regret in her mind over how she treated Joel towards the end, and that's something she's gonna have to live with. With her visiting Joel's grave at the end of the episode for the first time and placing coffee beans down above it, something that he loved. It showed that from here on out, everything that she was doing it for him. The seed was planted about what he did for her in rescuing her with the fireflies, with Gale revealing to her about how he told her that he saved her. So that's something that's going to be explored for sure as we move forward. There was also a subtle mention of Eugene again, and I desperately want to know what Joel did to him, so I hope that's something we do also find out. My review of the episode. I thought this was just an alright episode of the show. Following the previous one, this was never going to be as strong, and that was always clear to see. This was an episode that felt like it was very much about laying down the foundations for the second half of the season, and that's what we got. It cut to 3 months later, so we didn't really get to see many immediate reactions to Joel's death, but I feel we saw the ones that mattered most, Tommy and Ellie. And Ellie's one was extremely powerful. It rivaled what we saw at the end of episode 2. I thought the subtle teasing of how dangerous Wolf could be throughout this episode with the fearful nature that the cult had at the first glance of them, and then seeing just how inhumane they were in killing anything that was in front of them was perfect in making them feel like these awful villains. It subtly hinted at just how dangerous of a situation Ellie and Dina were walking into. The pacing of this episode is something that I'd say I did have a bit of an issue with. It just felt extremely choppy. There was no natural rhythm to it, and it did genuinely just move at whatever pace that it wanted to move at. I get that it needed to set up the quest that Ellie and Dina were going on and move things along quickly, but I think the pacing of it was something that was definitely felt. In terms of the performances, I'd say that they were all pretty strong, as per usual. I've come to be used to the quality of performances in this show, and it's very rare that there's a weak one. I watched the preview for the next episode, and I feel like it's one that's going to tower in quality over this one due to the action that seems to be present, and also the horror that could be embedded within it too. So I'm very much looking forward to next week's installment. So, there you have it, The Last of Us Season 2 Episode 3 Ending Explained. If you want to see every episode of The Last of Us Season 2 being broken down, then I've put the playlist below, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future videos. What did you think of this episode? Share your thoughts in the comments. As always, thanks for tuning into the video, and I'll see you in the next one.